All right, everybody. Good morning from Baltimore and the Johns Hopkins Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis. This is our monthly seminar. I'm Ian Saldana, an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology here. And I'd like to welcome everyone and welcome our speaker for today, who's Professor Mike Clarke, who's the professor and chair of research methodology at Queen's University, Belfast in Northern Ireland. Mike has had quite an illustrious career. He's the director of the Northern Ireland Clinical Trials Unit, the Northern Ireland Methodology Hub, and is the coordinating editor of the Cochrane Methodology Review Group. Over the years, he's been one of the founding members of the Cochrane collaboration. He's helped found the Core Outcome Sets for Effectiveness Trials, or COMET initiative, and as well as a couple of initiatives related to which he'll talk about today, which is the Studies Within a Trial and Studies Within a Review initiatives. He's had a lot of experience over the decades now, about 30 years plus experience in rigorously evaluating the effects of health and social care, including through a lot of work related to systematic reviews and clinical trials. So a lot of relevant work to our center. So we are very glad to have Mike give this seminar. Thank you for doing it, Mike. Welcome, and over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ian. Many thanks to both Ian and Karen, who I've known for some time now, for inviting me to talk to you this morning about SWOTs or SWOPs or SWARs. I'll share screen and take you through this journey on what they are, why we need them, show you some examples, and then hopefully have plenty of time for people to ask questions or to share ideas on what you might like to do in the context of embedding methodology research in health and social care. So as Ian said, I've been working for a long time in doing research relevant to health and social care. I'm not a practitioner, I'm not a statistician. I've just worked on the design and implementation of lots of studies, and I've learned lots of things as I've done so. And often I'll begin a talk by saying, well, why do we need evidence-based health and social care? What is it? What isn't it? So it's not just about the effects of care. So I've worked mostly on randomized trials and systematic reviews of randomized trials of interventions for health and social care. And they're about delivering reliable estimates of effect. But it also needs to include evidence and experience on feasibility, values, preferences, acceptability of health and social care. So it's not just it's 5.2% beneficial, it's those other things as well. Why we want the effect estimate, though, is good evidence on what interventions, actions, and strategies are beneficial, and by how much and for whom, which are harmful, which have little or no effect, is vital for well-informed decision-making, and good evidence should have minimized bias. So that's a slide that I will quite often use to introduce a talk about trials or systematic reviews. It all applies equally to the methods that we use for those trials and reviews. And in the concept of the SWOT, those are about trials. In the context of the SWAR, those are about reviews. And then SWOP, which is a term that some people are beginning to use, but we're dealing with the SWOPs inside the SWOTs. SWOP would be studies within a project. We deal with them inside the SWOTs because the SWOTs basically would fit any prospect study that is involving the recruitment, retention, study of human beings. So first point is we need good evidence on our methods. We need to know what's effective in our methods. And then a second slide I will often show is key principles for studies of the health effects of health and social care. And we don't expect the differences to be massive. We expect maybe moderate differences. If something is very dramatic in health and social care, we'll see that without the need for hundreds or thousands of people in randomized trials, without the need for systematic reviews of dozens of studies. We'll see the dramatic effects. Same would be true of methods. Again, in health and social care, moderate differences are worthwhile. If they're worthwhile, we need good evidence. Good evidence needs reliable research and needs to minimize bias and the effects of chance. Exactly the same for the methods. So if I, as someone who is going to promote research, is going to say to clinicians, you need to test your medicines, your physiotherapy, your surgery in order to see whether or not it is effective, more effective than alternatives, they should reflect to me, well, how do you know that the methods you're telling us to use for these studies are as reliable and as robust as possible? How do you know that there aren't better or cheaper ways to do it? And in the context now of the environment, how do you know that you're using the most carbon efficient methods? So that leads us to research into research. We have to ask ourselves, how do we know what we're doing is going to do more good than harm? Same thing we would ask of health and social care practitioners. How do they know that the interventions, actions, and strategies they will follow for their patients or their clients will do more good than harm? That's true of our methods. Our methods could do harm by destroying the ability of a piece of research to reliably answer its question. We need to be able to make well-informed choices about the methods. There's a variety of techniques we could use to recruit people, to retain people, to screen records for a systematic review, to report and implement the findings of research. So those of us who have to give advice to other people need to be confident that what we're giving is the most appropriate advice. And that's on the entire research journey, from choosing what studies to do through to implementing the findings and acting on the conclusions of studies. So we have to think about what is our evidence base and how can we enhance that so that we do the right research in the most appropriate way. Again, bearing in mind that in health and social care research, it's high stakes research. We're trying to improve health and well-being for people. And if we're working in mortality study areas, it's about preventing unnecessary premature deaths. So we need research into research. If we say we need research into health and social care, we should also say we need research into how to do that research. So out there. Well, one of the ways to get a sense of how much might be out there will be to look to systematic reviews of the methodology studies. I'm just going to highlight a few Cochrane methodology reviews and some reviews that are not from the methodology review group, which Ian mentioned that I'm coordinating editor of, and Karen is one of the editors for the methodology review group. But some of the other groups also work in areas that are relevant to the methodology for randomized trials and systematic reviews. So there's this review, Strategies to Improve Recruitment to Randomised Trials, led by Sean Truick, based in Aberdeen. Published last version in 2018, it's had a couple of updates. They're looking to update it again to bring it up to date. There's a lot of new material out there now, and the SWOT programme, which I'll describe in more detail shortly, has generated both new studies that would be relevant to this review, but also made it a bit easier to find those studies. What did they find in 2018? Well, they had 68 eligible studies, more than 74,000 participants. And these are studies that have been tested in randomized trials to see whether or not the strategy is more or less effective than another strategy for recruiting people. Most of the studies targeted the participants. So they were things to do with how you would what information you might give to participants, what incentives you might give to them, the relative merits of using a placebo or an open control. So 63 of the 68 studies were for participants. 5 of the studies targeted the people who would be doing the recruiting. Then go to the end of the study. So it's important to recruit as well as we can, but I will always argue that the most important thing is not to recruit a patient, is to follow them up so you have data that you can analyze. Recruiting someone and then losing them so that you don't have data you can analyze, or you have to impute that data, is a wasted effort. So much more important, in my view, is retention. This review was updated just a couple of years ago by Katie Gillis, who also works with Sean, building on work that Valerie Bruton, who's based in London, had done in the previous decade. They identified 70 eligible papers with more than 100,000 participants, but the vast majority of that evidence that was available for that version of the Cochrane methodology review related to responses to questionnaires. And that's not all there is to do in terms of retention. Only 2 of the studies, and some of the papers covered more than one study, and some of the strategies related to both questionnaires and clinical attendance, but only 2 studies. of how to improve the attendance at clinic for a follow-up visit of the participants in a trial. There are now several SWOT ongoing that are targeting that issue and not just looking at how we can improve response to, because I can set this in a wider context of a Cochrane methodology review that's now just gone into copy editing, so it's now in press, set to become perhaps the biggest ever Cochrane review, or certainly the biggest current Cochrane review, with more than 600 or 700 studies in it, which looks at response rates to postal and electronic questionnaires across everything. So in Katie's review, it's looking at retention in randomized trials. The more substantial postal and electronic questionnaires review looks at how can you boost response rates to surveys of what people buy in the supermarket, to how people are feeling about the educational experience they've received in a university, etc., etc. And that's a monster review, which we hope is going to appear before the end of the year as an update, 10 years on from the previous version of that review. But again, giving you clues. Does it make a difference if you give people a financial incentive, if you give them a pen? Does it make a difference if you ease the burden that there might be in terms of follow-up, in terms of, say, the length of the questionnaire? Then we have things that are focusing on some of the specific aspects of getting patients into trials and giving them reliable information. So 2014 review from the Consumers and Communication Group in Cochrane looked at audiovisual presentation of information when you're obtaining informed consent. 2014, so now it's nearly 10 years old, and things have changed a lot. The last 3.5 years of COVID changed how we recruit to trials. So review potentially in big need of update. At the time it was done, 16 studies, just under 2,000 participants. 8 studies were done in real trials, 7 were in hypothetical trials, and 1 in both. And there is a challenge in whether or not the way that you would provide information to people about a hypothetical trial is actually a reliable guide to what might happen when you're actually talking to someone about joining a real trial, when they really are heading to randomization between the treatments. And finally, decision aids, another review led by Katie Gillis. And can decision aids help people? And a lack of evidence. This is 2015. This review was done. Only 1 study, 290 participants, embedded in 2 real clinical trials. So to set all of that in context, I've just shown you 4 Cochrane reviews, and they're covering less than 200 studies in some of the main aspects of how to recruit people to trials. Put it in context. It's very difficult to know just how many randomized trials have taken place, but it's at least 500,000. If I go to clinicaltrials.gov, I can find that there are more than 80,000 trials in clinicaltrials.gov that are either recruiting or are setting up to recruit right now. And then if we say to ourselves, well, how much methodological research is there to underpin those trials? Up until the push that we're doing with the SWOT program, there were less than 1,000. It's really hard to know how many there are. They're incredibly difficult to find, but I would probably be confident there's 500 or 600, if that. So saying there's less than 1,000, I think is fairly safe territory. So again, you can, 500,000 trials done, 80,000 ongoing now, maybe only 1,000 pieces of research to try and improve the methods of those trials. And those methodological studies, that research into research, I would say we need it across the entire spectrum. And we need it to be encouraged and designed and then done and then reported and then disseminated and then reviewed and brought into systematic reviews and kept up to date. So the same spectrum of need that we would see for health and social care research generally, we need it for research into research. So that led to us trying to formalize the concept of these methodology studies and giving them a name, calling them SWOT, study within a trial. And as I've said, SWOP is interchangeable with this. And one of the reasons for giving it a name is that if people start using this name, then when we go to PubMed or Embase to try and find these embedded studies, hopefully they'll be easier to find. The challenge that we've all had as we've tried to look for these studies outside of the context of them being called SWOTs is sometimes they're buried as one or two paragraphs inside the report of a randomized trial. And unless we're prepared to review the records for hundreds of thousands of randomized trials in the hope that we will find paragraphs about an embedded SWOT, we're not going to find them. So giving them a name was a starting point. They can be done within a trial, or I would say within any prospective study. They aim to resolve uncertainty about an aspect of the conduct of the trial, sometimes to try and help that trial. So if the trial is going to recruit for 3 or 4 years, and we can identify the most effective strategies for recruitment in the first year or 2 years, we can adopt those strategies, adopt the winner in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th year of the trial. More typically, though, they're going to inform future practice. Anywhere on the trial pathway, from prioritization through design, conduct analysis, dissemination, accessibility of the results of the trial, and then implementation. We can easily ask and try and answer questions about how best to ensure that the results of trials get used in guidelines, get used by practitioners, get used by patients. They're experimental or observational. Most of the ones that are being done now are themselves randomized trials. They're experimental trials testing different interventions, actions, or strategies. But sometimes it's observational. It simply could well be looking at how well they in different sites for this trial, given that the different sites have different catchment areas and different types of patient presenting to them. So they can be observational, and they can also be either quantitative or qualitative. So we're looking at the entire range of potential research. Encouraging prospective registration, and that's where the concept of the SWOT repository came from, and encouraging that using a standardized, very simple format for the outlines and collating those centrally. So it's a one-stop shop for those, and ideally getting them registered in advance, just as we strongly encourage trialists to register their research in advance, so we can then know what's ongoing, know what's closed and maybe is due for publication, but also know what may have closed and may not be being published, perhaps because of the results. So where did it begin? Well, SWOT-1, a decade ago, we published the protocol for SWOT-1 in the Journal of Evidence-Based Medicine. So you will see, I'll show you several examples of articles, and I'll put the citation for each of the articles onto the screen as well. And as you know, this is being recorded, so if you capture this now if you want to, but if you want to look back, you can easily find these articles. So we published SWOT-1 in 2013 as a protocol to try and encourage people. Not many protocols for SWOTs have been published, and that's partly we perhaps suggest the availability of the SWOT outlines in the SWOT repository. So what was SWOT-1? The context for it was a multi-center trial for women in labor, women giving birth. There was a problem inside that trial. So this was a trial that was taking place over many, many years of recruitment. Recruitment had slowed down in several centers. And the challenge was, what can we do to boost recruitment? But also, we don't just want to boost recruitment, find that we've recruited lots of new participants to the study, but they're not participants who are going to stay with us for the duration of the study and provide the follow-up data that we need for the analyses. A possible solution was for the principal investigator to go to each of the centers that were recruiting to encourage them to join. And the research design was to randomly allocate the order of those visits. So not to go necessarily to the most struggling sites first, but to randomly go to the sites and then compare recruitment before and after that visit, where the control sites would be the other sites, with the anchor date being the date that the principal investigator was in Dublin, and we could look at how they were doing in Cork or Belfast or before and after that very same date. The outcome was proportion of eligible women who were recruited in the short and medium term. So that was in the month or so after the site visit, and then in the 3 to 6 months thereafter. And also looking at retention, that possibility that you get a surge in recruitment because of great enthusiasm to recruit, but not necessarily recruiting people who are going to stay with you throughout the trial. It was published in 2015 in the journal Trials, and the conclusion was that the SWOT1 provides evidence that the site visit combined with the scheduled meeting of the staff there, so that principal investigators didn't turn up at the site. There was a meeting of all of the staff based at that recruiting site, and it did lead to a small boost in recruitment for that particular trial. Again, you can see that this is, so should we do it? And it's not a strange idea for the PI to go and visit a site, but if the PI goes to visit a site, and if that PI is, maybe their time is better spent recruiting where they're based, maybe it's better spent doing completely different things. So we need the research that said that, and in this example, in this context, it did show an improvement. So then, very similar slide to the SWOT slide, just in relation to the SWOTs. They're done within a review, within a systematic review. It's about resolving uncertainty. We have many uncertainties as we're doing systematic reviews about the best ways to do that. And there's a lot of thinking going on now, and there are several SWOs registered recently to look at how we could speed up some of the processes of systematic reviews by drawing on the potential benefits of machine learning or artificial intelligence. They're anywhere on the review pathway, so same pathway as there are for trials, same journey as there is for a trial, from prioritization through to implementation of the results. Experimental, observational, quantitative, qualitative, and encouraging the prospective registration. So to give you an example, SWOR2, the context was a Cochrane review of the effects of electric fans on adverse health impacts in heat waves. This review was completed in 2012, shortly before the London Olympics, with a view to informing the heatwave plan for the United Kingdom, in particular for London, in case a heatwave had hit London at the time of the 2012 Olympics. Fortunately, there was no heatwave. Weather was probably, if anything, milder than usual. The problem we were looking at in SWOR2 was how can we get people to understand the key messages from a systematic review if they just look at the summary. So the summary could be less than 500 or 600 words long. The full review might be thousands of words long and many pages. Can they get the key message that the authors have placed into the summary? And possible solution could be, well, let's use different types of summary, both written and audio. And the design that was adopted was that people that were volunteered to join the study were randomly given either the written abstract, so the scientific abstract, the plain language summary, which many of you will know every Cochrane review has a plain language summary, a script for the podcast to read, or the audio podcast itself to listen to. We now have about 700 audio podcasts for Cochrane reviews, and we're producing them at the rate now of about 1 or 2 per week as another avenue of dissemination of Cochrane reviews. They're typically 300 to 500 words long, and the listen is 3 to 5 minutes long. So they're on a similar length to the other classic summaries. And the outcome measure was what proportion of the participants were able to answer questions correctly about the key finding of the review that was contained in all 4 summaries. Published 2014, so SWOR1 came out slightly before, but has been presented at a conference, hasn't made it into a full journal article, not because of issues around publication bias, but issues because of the potential interest of a journal article. SWOR1 looks at whether or not you should screen records for a systematic review by checking titles and abstracts simultaneously, or checking the titles very quickly and then only looking at the abstracts for the papers that you feel might be eligible on the basis of their title. But what is SWOR2 found, it's a small study, and again I'll talk about that in a moment, and found that the differences were not statistically significant, but that the audio summary did appear to be slightly better. The power of these SWOTs and SWORs is limited by how many people are going to be involved in the study, and they're not powered to achieve statistically significant results usually of a meaningful outcome, because part of the concept is that if many people will repeat them, we then do a meta-analysis. That gives us consistency or inconsistency of findings, increases the power, and also shows whether or not the findings might be similar or different in different contexts. So we're trying to encourage, and we have been for a while now, more people to do another version of SWOR2, so we could see whether or not we get similar findings on the written summaries compared to the audio summaries. So moving to the outlines that we have for SWOTs and SWORs. Standard outline. I'm not going to read through this on the screen, and usually the outlines fit into 1 or 2 pages. They are not the formal protocol for the SWOT or the SWOR. They're there simply to give people a rough idea of what will be done inside this embedded methodology research. The SWOT and the SWOR programs, again, they're about a decade old now, and we established them to provide a repository of ideas, to give people the opportunity to prospectively register. Some SWOTs have been registered in trial registries such as clinicaltrials.gov. Some SWOTs have been formally registered alongside the host trial in which they are embedded. But SWOTs, there wasn't really an opportunity for people to register them in any formal registry. And that was one of the reasons to create the repositories, encouraging people as far as possible to prospectively register. The hope is to encourage collaboration so that people will see a SWOT that's already there and do something similar, or try and collaborate in the SWOT prospectively, or collaborate in the SWOT with a retrospective meta-analysis. And Trial Forge is an initiative of Sean Truick, who I've already mentioned, for the recruitment review, based in Aberdeen, that's trying to make it easier to access information on good ways to do randomized trials. And there's the URL. The URL is going to appear on a few more screens as well. It's a short URL. The full URL is far too big to fit on a slide because it's of how Queen's University Belfast organises its URLs. But because of that very lengthy URLs, it also has this go.qub.ac.uk opportunity, which allows people to have a much shorter URL which maps to the long one. And on that website, there's information about the SWOT and the SWOR programs. Again, we're going to update this shortly to encourage people to register what they might want to call a SWOP in the SWOT repository. We don't want to create a third repository for SWOP studies within a project where many of them are similar to the SWOTs, and several of the early SWOTs were not embedded in randomized trials. So there was an early SWOT looking at how to boost recruitment for a case control study, and it was tested incentives that might well be used in randomized trials. Again, the concept being a prospective trial in humans is something in which a methodological piece of research relating to recruitment retention could easily be buried. People who wish to register a SWOT, a very simple online form, which we're tweaking slightly over the coming months, but it asks people to say who they are. So I'm not going to show you the whole form, who they are, the source of the idea, any revisions that have been made to the SWOT, the date of the idea. We want to give due recognition to people that have prepared the SWOT, and then maybe people that they've worked with to revise it and refine it, for example, as they're beginning to pilot it. Statement of the objectives, the study area that it might be in. Is it prioritization? Is it dissemination? And then the interventions and comparators. As I said, many SWOTs are experimental. Many SWOTs are randomized trials of their own right, clearly with one or more interventions and a comparator. Occasionally they are observational. Occasionally they might be qualitative outside of the context of an experiment. And then people just use this section. They simply have to write in one intervention. And these are the interventions or comparators for the SWOT. These are not the randomized trial intervention of drug versus or physiotherapy versus surgery for managing a condition. These are the interventions and comparators for the SWOT. And just to show you the SWOT store, so again, I'll touch on at the end how we need to improve this. At the moment, it's a very flat list. All of there's a 2 or 3 page PDF for every SWOT's available from the links, and it just runs from the identifier that was assigned to the SWOT when it was submitted, edited, checked by the submitter, and then loaded. And we're now all the way down to the most recent one was loaded just a couple of weeks ago, and it's SWOT 217. Some numbers are missing because somebody might register send us a SWOT, we assign it a number, they might then decide that they don't want it to appear because they're not actually going to do it. We have SWOTs that were hypothetical, were never done. We have SWOTs that were hoped to be done, but perhaps the funding for them post-trial didn't materialize. And then we have SWOTs that have definitely been done. So there are some gaps in there. We try and keep them on just as ideas, even if the person that registered them won't pursue them. But sometimes people want to just remove it. So there are gaps, but it's more than 200 actual PDFs are there for the SWOTs. So what happens next? What are we thinking? Well, we've got more than 200 SWOT and just 25 SWOT registered at the moment. We're hoping to see an increase in SWOT, in particular as we get more interest in things, for example, like the machine learning I've mentioned, but also the main funder of health research in the public sector in the UK, National Institute of Health and Care Research, now encourages people to embed a SWOT in any prospective study, a SWOT in any systematic review that NIHR is going to fund, and it allows people to ask for up to £30,000 to do that SWOT or SWOR. They've recently issued some updated guidance on that, and part of that drew more attention to the SWOR program. So we are hoping that that is going to attract more attention to the SWOR. But many more are needed. Again, as I've hinted, maybe there were 700 or 800 a decade ago. Maybe we've pushed the number through 1,000 now with the repository. But some of those would have taken place anyway. But some of them have definitely been stimulated by the concept of SWOTs and SWORs being more widely promoted. But if we've got 80 to 100,000 trials ongoing right now, if we've got tens of thousands of reviews ongoing right now, we need a much stronger evidence base to ensure that we're avoiding waste, maximizing efficiency, and maximizing the effectiveness of the methods. We are going to revise the template to add in space for results. One of the challenges that people have encountered is the difficulty of publishing a SWOT, especially if it's underpowered, outside of the context of publishing it in the main trial report or publishing a SWOR outside the review. So to try and help people with that, just as the trial registries are now allowing people to deposit their results in the trial registry, we are going to modify the template to allow people a space to report on the results in the template. And we need to improve the searchability. When there were a few dozen SWOT, you could scroll down and easily find something that might be of interest. Now there's more than 200. Scrolling down in an order that is simply a chronological order of submission doesn't make a great deal of sense. So we're looking at ways to add index terms to allow people to quickly retrieve things that are to do with recruitment or retention or other aspects of a trial, to quickly retrieve things that might be relevant to pediatric or adult trials, to chronic condition trials, to acute trials. So work on that is ongoing, especially with the Trial Forge team. And we hope to build a data repository where people could, in a very structured format, place their data. So recruited out of randomized to the SWOT intervention, recruited out of randomized to the SWOT control group, and therefore facilitate the ability for people to very easily do cumulative meta-analyses. And some of those may well be hosted on the Trial Forge website, where, as has happened with, for example, what the French Cochrane Centre did for COVID, allowing the generation of real-time forest plots for many of the trials of COVID, we could borrow similar technology for the SWOTs and the SWOR. So allow someone to very quickly go and say, what is the accumulated evidence on financial incentives to boost retention, to boost the likelihood that a patient will return to clinic for follow-up? To give you an example, as I'm drawing things to a close, SWOT 82, published a couple of years ago in the BMJ Christmas issue, and you'll clearly see why in a moment. The context was multiple randomized trials. So SWOT 82 was designed by the York Clinical Trials University in the north of England, York University Clinical Trials Unit in the north of England, to be embedded in multiple trials in adults in the UK across a whole range of conditions. The problem was that retention is key to obtaining reliable results, as I've mentioned already. And one possible solution, which is not uncommon in some of the clinical trials units and some of the clinical trials that we're aware of in the UK, and we're now doing a survey just to capture how common it is, but maybe something that is done in trials in the USA, maybe it's done maybe not around Christmas, maybe around Thanksgiving, but their issue was, we're sending these Christmas cards out. Are they beneficial, encouraging continued participation? Are they harmful? Are they a waste of time, money, carbon? Are they something we should consider doing that we're not doing? So they simply randomized the participants across a series of trials to be sent a Christmas card or not to be sent a Christmas card. And the outcomes that they looked at was how retained for future follow-up in the trials, and what was the cost per retained participant. So allowing people to make a judgment on whether or not it would be worth investing in sending Christmas cards. And we're increasingly trying to add this cost effectiveness component to all of the SWOTs. What is the additional cost to recruit one more patient? What is the additional cost to retain one more patient? What is the additional cost to accelerate the way in which clean data arrives in the trials unit? So we're beginning to look at those things. And as I said, published in the Christmas issue of the BMJ 2 years ago. And what did it find? Well, it found that sending Christmas cards to adults in the UK-based does not increase retention. Well, it's a very strong statement from them. That's the cumulative meta-analysis that they included in the BMJ article. Again, those of you familiar with this sort of plot, if the diamond is to the left of the vertical line, it favors the, in this example, favors no Christmas card. If it's to the right, it favors the Christmas card. So by the end of these 8 studies, the results on retention were, if anything, in favor of not sending a Christmas card. You had more retained participants without it, but it's a 4% benefit in terms of retention, and very wide confidence interval, clearly not statistically significant. But on the basis of this, many of us would probably conclude there's no real evidence to suggest that this is a beneficial activity, and it does come with it a resources, a financial and a carbon cost. They couldn't go on and say, well, what does this mean for cost per retained participant? Just as we can't calculate a statistic, some of you are familiar with the number needed to treat. If the treatment is harmful, then the number needed to treat is sort of negative infinity or something similar for this. They couldn't calculate the cost per retained participant because, if anything, the Christmas cards were making it worse. So what happens next? Repeat of that slide is more work to do. And just finally, what I would say to you as we move into questions, get SWOT, SWOP or SWORing. And if you want some guidance papers on what is a SWOT, then Sean Truick led the Trial Forge guidance on what is a study within a trial, published in Trials in 2018. And just about a year or so ago, Declan Devan led a paper on explaining what is a SWOR, which was published in the Journal of Evidence-Based Medicine, as I've said, just about a year or so ago. So I'll draw things to a close there, stop sharing, and pass back to Ian or Karen to open it up to questions and comments. And I hope I have inspired some feeling of, well, what could we be studying in the trials, projects and reviews that we are now doing? Back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Mike. That was a fantastic presentation, a great walkthrough of the history and the present and of where we are with SWOTs and SWORs. This is very informative. So to everybody, if you have a question, maybe raise your hand in the Zoom and I'll call you on, and we'll go from there. Karen, go ahead.
So I had trouble finding my hand. Thank you, Mike. Always great to see you. And I get to talk to you again on Monday morning, I see in my calendar. So that's great. I had a quick question for you. How would you suggest that people prioritize questions or topics to do a SWOT or SWOR? Is there a way to use the repositories to figure out a priority, to not just do yet another Christmas card one, but you know where the gaps are?
That's a really, really important question, Karen. So there's two things. One is that's one of the reasons we need to improve the searchability of the repository, because scrolling 200 to try and find something that you might want to mimic is challenging. So we will improve that searchability. And the other side is some of the Trial Forward SWOT team are looking at when can we decide that a SWOT no longer needs to be done. Because what we don't want to see happening is tremendous enthusiasm for, ooh, wouldn't it be nice to test Christmas cards? The conclusion of the SWOT 82 BMJ article was that would be a waste of time, certainly in a UK adult perspective. So we are looking at ways that we would be able to say to people, unless you have a very strong reason to believe that your context is different to the existing context, don't do this SWOT. We've all seen it over time. Massive enthusiasm comes along for something and then everybody starts doing it. I mean, one of the other big Cochrane methodology reviews is Bobby Shearer's review of, do conference abstracts go on to full publication? And that review is just sort of grinding because there's hundreds of people have just said, oh, that's a nice idea, let's do it. Well, Bobby's review shows that basically it's about 50%. And so we do want to try and find ways to encourage people not to unnecessarily repeat SWOTs. And that's a potential harm of the SWOT repository, which could be that people see the idea and say, oh, I'll do one of them. When there wasn't a repository, maybe that didn't happen. So we're looking at ways to avoid unnecessarily duplication, but make it easier for people to find they might like to mimic. And there are prioritization exercises going on as well to see what are the most important questions that people would have that could be amenable to SWOT. So there's some very important questions about the methods of research, but they might not be amenable to a SWOT or a SWOR approach. Thanks.
So while others are thinking of other questions, one question I had was, so you showed numbers to us about how many SWOTs have been done and relative to how many trials there are out there. And you alluded to this a couple of times about studies embedded within non-randomized studies. Yep. So I guess the question is, is there an estimate of how many of those there are? And are those... Yeah,
so it's similar. So the earlier version of the recruitment review included non-randomized studies. So recruitment to other studies. And one of the reasons I think that they abandoned that in the update, which I put on the screen, the 2018 update, was there were so few. And their focus really was on randomized SWOTs in randomized trials. So we're not aware of very many. People have the ability to register them in the SWOT repository, and I would say it's probably less than 10%. Other types of prospective research, such as the ones I mentioned, a case control study that tested whether or not offering people, it was a UK study, offering people £20 would encourage them to come forward as a potential control in a case control study of a very nasty blood disorder. And the £20 made no difference. And it actually cost the university about £30 to process a £20 payment to a potential participant, which meant that not only did it not make much difference, but it was actually costing large amount. But again, the financial incentives, one of the virtues of that, and used in cohort studies as well, is that many people just assume it will be beneficial. You suddenly start handing out $20 or $50 to everyone to encourage them to join the study. Many of those people would have joined without the $20 or $50, but you've handed that money out, and it might not make a difference to people, because one of the challenges with something like the financial incentive, unless you set it very high, well, if you set it very high, people might think, what's scary about this trial? Why do you need to give me $500 to join this trial? If you set it very low, people might feel you so undervalue my participation. I would have joined for nothing. I'm not joining for $20. That's an insult. So research into that is still desperately needed, because a knee-jerk reaction that many people have is just throw the money at it and it will work. But the studies, the randomized trials that have been done, do not support something like the incentives. But I think incentives could be particularly important in things like observational research. And then retention becomes vital. If your cohort falls to pieces, if you've got selective retention. If we've got a trial and we lose people from both arms, we might try and adjust for it. Got a cohort and lose people from the cohort, all sorts of assumptions are needed about whether or not they behave the same way as the retained or not.
Thanks, Mike. Seth?
Thanks, Mike, for the nice presentation and giving your insightful talk on SWOT and SWORs. My question is regarding SWOR. So do you think a prioritization process is also necessary for the SWOR to avoid unnecessary duplications and to identify the potential questions of SWOR?
I think so, but at the moment there are so few SWOR that I'm one of those. There used to be a saying of sort of throw the seeds and let all the flowers bloom, and then maybe we should start cutting back on the flowers. So at the moment, there's a sense of we're not quite sure. There is very recently established in the UK, and again, people who are familiar with Cochrane and the funding of Cochrane. So our main funder pulled out of funding the Cochrane review groups in the UK and has put the money into what are called evidence synthesis groups, where the reviews will be prioritised for the National Health Service. And they are encouraging SWORs. And there's a group of us in a working group inside that programme of 9 centres across the UK doing reviews, where we're trying to embed similar SWORs across them and get consistency. Again, then to get the power, if you can show it in 8 reviews that are very different, that this is a good way to screen articles, then the 9th review doesn't need to do the SWOR. It just needs to act on the result of the SWOR if the results are consistent. So at the moment for the SWORs, we're less worried about unnecessary duplication, because we don't have enough of them to start worrying about that. But prioritization, I think, is key. And that's what we're doing inside this evidence synthesis group program. But it's also what are the easy ones that maybe could be done almost without thinking, that could generate some evidence. And one of the ones we're embedding in our evidence synthesis group is simply a qualitative study, qualitative mixed with quantitative study of how much time people spend and how they feel about the time that they're spending on the different aspects of a review. The quantitative side of that will be done across numerous reviews, and will answer the question many of us are always asked by students as well: how long does it take to do a review? And we have to say, well, you know, again, in a sort of how long's a piece of string as a sort of throwaway, but it depends on so many things. If we can get some reliable data across dozens of reviews, maybe we can start saying to people, well, this is how long it might actually take. This is the number of hours and days and weeks and months that it might take. But it's a really important point, Safe. And I hope we get to a position of having so many SWOR that we do need to start worrying about unnecessary duplication.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I want to take the opportunity to provide one information that you already provided regarding the SWOR fundings from the UK funding groups. In addition to that, you know, I work for Evidence Synthesis Ireland and Cochrane Ireland, and we also provide a seed funding for SWORs and every year. So this year we funded 3 projects, and that call will be open again next year. It's mostly for the primary researchers who are based on Ireland, either Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland, but there can be international collaboration, and researchers from anywhere in the world can collaborate.
Thanks, Dave. And I think that's a fantastic piece of investment from Health Research Board through Evidence Synthesis Ireland to encourage this sort of activity. And I'm also aware of the work you're doing to try and help prioritise that process. And it, you know, for the general audience, what you've said there at the end is key. That the lead, one of the reviewers may be based on the island of Ireland, but you're not restricting funding to everybody being based on the island of Ireland. And in the international collaborative spirit of doing reviews, it'd be brilliant to have some of that seed funding supporting activity that involves our colleagues in the US.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Karen?
Yeah, so my question's related to that. It's exciting to hear that there's some funding for Ireland and the NIHR, but currently, I don't think there is any here that I know of. And conversely, I'll just speak from the SWOR point of view. Ian knows this very well. You know, a lot of the reviews that we're doing are contractual based. They're very tight timelines, tight budget. What do you say to those people who are doing reviews or trials with limited, at least perceived limited time and resources? How do you make that doing a SWOR or a SWOT priority for those people? What can we do to encourage them, either them as individuals or the system?
So I would take the line that we've taken all the time with the health and social care practitioners. How do you know what you're doing is the best possible way of doing it? So that's the first line, is the uncertainty around the methods. one of the other changes we're going to make to the template is to try and add actual costing information to it. So not the cost effectiveness of the SWOT, but how much would it cost to do this SWOT? Some of them are incredibly cheap to do. For example, the Christmas card one it needed a little bit of organization inside the distribution of the Christmas cards. But if you were working in a trial that was routinely sending Christmas cards and you stop sending half of them in a randomized way, you're saving money. So they're not necessarily all expensive. The most expensive ones are the ones that involve a lot of researcher time, especially if, for example, qualitative research is pinned on and you're going to need to do interviews, transcribe the interviews, the qualitative analysis. We trying to encourage people to see is the ability to do them for very low cost if the interventions you're going to compare are very low cost and the outcome data is what we would call the routine data for the trial, which is how many people did you approach and how many did you recruit. And if you haven't got that data as a trialist, you've got a problem with your data as a trialist. If you don't follow up, you've got a problem as a trialist. So getting that into the template, I think will help people see, well, I could do one of these quite cheaply, or I have a choice. The SWOR one, which I mentioned, the screening simultaneously of titles and abstracts or sequentially, is not a difficult one to do, in the sense that you're going to have to screen the titles and abstracts. So why not have one screener do it this way for half the sample and the other way, and then swap and then compare the findings. Again, it's a tiny bit of intricacy maybe in the software you're using for the screening, but incredibly cheap and contribute it in. So that is one of the ones that we're hoping might get done generically across the evidence synthesis groups. And it'd be really exciting to be able to collaborate internationally on that. The other challenge, and you have raised something which needs to be said, is also a challenge, is people thinking, well, do I need to get ethics for this? How much burden is there going to be for me to go and get ethics? I just see that someone's put that in the chat. Yeah, we are working with the major oversight groups in the UK for ethics to try and come up with some generic guidance, which will hopefully be shared internationally. And the view is if it's low risk to the participants and it's fair, then ethics is not necessarily needed separately for it. And what the guidance we're trying to work on is the happy place to be as a researcher guidance, where you get a letter from the ethics committee saying you don't need to apply for ethical approval. And that's what you can waive at a journal that says, where's your ethical approval? And you don't have to fill in all of the forms. So there are burdens associated with the SWOTs and the SWORs. And we hopefully will be able to reassure people about some of those burdens, allowing them to embed things at very low cost into their project, and hopefully enthuse their more junior colleagues about research if they themselves are doing a research project inside that bigger research project. And that was one of the reasons for formalizing the process, is to get junior colleagues, give them ownership of research when they might not feel ownership of the whole trial or the whole review or the whole cohort study.
I'm not seeing any current questions in the chat or hands raised, but related to journals, I was wondering, maybe it's too soon for something like this, but are there journals out there that are sort of, before they publish this sort of work, perhaps the SWOT, that they're looking for pre-registration, or is that not yet a thing?
It is beginning to occur, especially if they feel this SWOT randomized human beings to interventions. The interventions are not health and social care. They might be a financial incentive. They might be two different information leaflets. But we have had journals say, has this been prospectively registered? So the SWOT repository is not an officially recognized registry in that the WHO rules apply to. So we do encourage people, if it feels as though that is likely to crop up from a journal, because it feels like a bigger intervention than some of the low-level stuff, then registering it. And that's why, a few of them have gone to clinicaltrials.gov. I think there were some in ISRCTN that we need to. I wouldn't want to see a SWOT bounce back because a journal says, where's the prospective registration? And we're not in a position to make the SWOT repository WHO compliant. It would require much more, many more fields to be added than we now have. So we can't take that route. It is an important point that people, I think, will increasingly be concerned about.
Mike, there's a question in the chat from Nicholas. How do we deal with ethical issues that may arise in the SWOT that are not addressed in the initial IRB process?
You've got to go back to the IRB or the ethics committee. Same as if you make a modification to the trial. If you change the eligibility criteria for the host trial, if you change some of the outcome instruments you might use, you need to go back to ethics. Again, that's what we're trying to work out with the national ethics organisers in the UK, is when should somebody come back? What do they need? I'm always on the side of go to the ethics committee or the IRB beforehand. And cross your fingers and hope they'll give you that. You don't need ethics approval, but it's better to have that, not just because of the bureaucracy and so on. It's always good to have an independent person look at any research you're going to do on a human being. They may spot things that you haven't spotted. So I think there are issues of going back to ethics, and that is a challenge that chief investigators will often say. We're not interested in the trial managers and the trial coordinators and the trials unit putting a SWOT in. That's just going to make it more complex for us. Please go away. We also have them saying we can't express uncertainty about our information leaflets, and we come back and say, but you're expressing uncertainty about your drugs. Why not about this method of recruitment? But the ethics side of things is something that we're trying to develop some guidance on, which hopefully people will be able to use it with their local IRBs as well.
Thanks, Mike. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you, Claire. Juan Yepes here from Colombia. I was just wondering if, there are strategies or frameworks for integrating the SWARs into systematic review protocols without causing, any additional burdens of these products. Thank you.
It's a very important point. Again, we're going to experience of the first year of the evidence synthesis groups in the UK to work that out. We are, so the group I belong with, which is Aberdeen Belfast at ARBEC, we are putting them in the protocols. We're mentioning the SWAR, so we're embedding 2 SWAR routinely in all of our reviews, and some additional SWARs as well, maybe, but we're embedding them in the protocol. And again, then we're hoping one of the things that we're doing with the Trial Forge network is trying to build on that network's website examples of these things, examples of grant applications, ethics applications, protocols, so that people could go and look and say, okay, so that's how I would put it into my protocol. I'm not aware yet, for example, of a Cochrane protocol that contains an embedded SWAR, but we're trying to nudge people that way to show how they would show it. It doesn't need a separate protocol, because usually that 1 or 2 paragraphs is adequate.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm not seeing any hands raised or further comments or questions in the chat. So maybe let's wrap it up here. Mike, thank you so much for this. This was a very, very great introduction and summary of where we are with SWOTs and SWARs. Very stimulating seminar. Thank you for doing this, and take care, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Mike. See you on Monday.
Thanks very much. See you Monday, Karen. Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity.